Cool. Thank you everyone for joining. Why don't we just start with, as people kind of funnel in, we'll start with intros, just so you know who we are and our backgrounds, and then we can get into talking about product launches. Derek, yeah, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, hey everybody. Excited to chat today. Basically, I'm a former product marketing leader. I basically, most recently was running product marketing at Rippling, to help them scale up from seed through Series B. Prior to that, I've had stops both big companies and large and small companies, a lot of early stage startups, running marketing and growth. And then, most like early in my career, I was launching big AAA games at PlayStation. I've also launched companies now as a founder, as well as a portfolio advisor for a venture studio. So done a lot of different types of launches. And these days, I'm running Ignition, which is, a platform for helping product marketing teams to get to market with new products, features, campaigns, et cetera, and helping to kind of align with marketing, sales, and product through that process. So pumped to be chatting about this, and we'll get a lot of cool stuff to go through.
Cool. Thank you, Derek. Yeah, my name is Evan Huck. I'm the CEO and co-founder of UserEvidence. My background is mostly in leading enterprise sales teams. So I started at this startup called Tech Validate as the first salesperson, grew it to like 60 salespeople and 15 million in ARR when it was acquired by SurveyMonkey. And then I led the enterprise sales efforts for SurveyMonkey for 3 or 4 years. And then, yeah, been doing UserEvidence for 2.5 years now. We're about 25 people now, a little bit north of 2 million in ARR. So definitely a startup, but I've been involved with product launches a lot on the kind of later stage. Once the thing is launched, the go-to-market team and sales team needs to sell it, and they're a huge channel for communicating with both prospects and customers. But I was telling Derek at the start, we have a big public launch coming up in mid-August. We're going through this right now, and then lots of learnings and challenges as well that I can talk about. So.
Yeah, well, pumped to dig in. So we're going to go through a few things today. We're going to talk about like why you should, think about launches in the first place and like why they're important. We're going to talk about like how to set, effective goals around those and like what the goals of a good launch process should be. Also like, what you're going to get right and you're probably going to get wrong, in some of your launches, and like what the keys to succeeding are, how to build that process. And then how to also be, more customer centric and infuse, research and user evidence into your process as you're getting through from the earliest pre-planning stages all the way through post launch. So Evan's gonna probably chime in with a lot of like firsthand, very very recent experience going through this launch that they're going through today, but. So first, let's talk about like kind of why launches are important, right? So, I think launches, they're one of those things, and this is whether you're launching a product or you're launching a feature or you're launching, a new market or a campaign. They are really, really large revenue drivers, even if, like the attribution on them can be challenging. Because they're one of the primary ways that you can unlock new upsell and cross-sell opportunities for the sales teams. By definition, you're introducing something new, so it's a new thing for them to either talk about or to sell if it's got an actual price associated with it. If it's a new market, you're expanding your TAM into a new audience, and then they're also really big revenue or retention drivers for existing customers as well, because those folks are going to then see your product velocity. You may be closing a feature gap that was causing them to be at risk of churning. So it's critical to get this stuff communicated to customers. When you don't, you end up leaving a lot of revenue opportunity on the table. They're also just costly processes. There's a lot of people involved, a lot of teams involved. You're spending significant amounts of dev time building the thing that you're launching. So if you don't get them right, you end up leaving a decent amount of money that just ends up getting lit on fire. And also when launches are poorly communicated, a lot of times it introduces churn as well, because customers end up getting confused. So these are pretty critical problems to solve for most companies, and a lot of companies they haven't really built the muscle yet early on. So what kind of should be like your objectives when you're launching stuff? Ultimately, like the number one thing that like the launch process exists for is to help kind of create clarity across teams and help kind of align execution from product all the way through marketing, all the way through sales. And so what that means is like basically everybody kind of needs to be on the same page about like the reason why you're launching the thing in the first place and like what you're hoping to achieve. So what are your goals? Those folks need to know like who that launch is targeting, whether that's a segmentation of like existing customers versus new prospects, or it's more granular around specific personas. They need to know like who should we actually be talking about this thing to, and so who's our audience. They also need to understand like what that audience needs to actually believe in order to take the action that you want them to take. So, what message are you trying to drive home into their head? How are you trying to frame that product, both relative to your existing services as well as relative to any competitive services that they may already have in their mind. And then, the last two bits are kind of like much more tactical execution. Where are you actually trying to get that message across to customers? How are you actually going to reach them with it? And then how are you going to actually do all of this stuff? So how are you going to model the way that the product is priced and packaged? How is it going to be bought by customers? Are you going to phase your rollout and do a soft launch to them, via a quieter beta period? Or are you just going to go out guns blazing right out of the gate and do a hard launch to the entire world all at once? And then like what specific things do you need to get done, which is like where I think a lot of companies end up thinking about launches is like it's our checklist, and what are the tasks that we need to get done in order to get this thing live. But all of this other stuff above that is what really ends up driving success here. And so it's the stuff to like think about launches through that lens more and more strongly.
I have a question. How do you like what constitutes or deserves like a major launch? Like how do you decide, what's worthy of all this effort and coordination versus just let's get some product out there and people will find out about it?
Yeah, totally. Well, so I think one of the things to keep in mind is like launches aren't necessarily the same as releases. So a lot of companies, they think like, okay, well, we ship this thing, so we can't launch it. The fact is these things can be decoupled. You can release a thing to customers first and then do a larger kind of launch announcement around it later. So that is always an option. I think like when you're thinking about like what constitutes, like what needs a launch and what doesn't, I think anything that is like meaningfully important to customers, like you should have some degree of launch around. It can be, and this is where tiering frameworks come in handy, is, like identifying some frameworks for, like, is this thing going to add value to the business? Is it going to add value to customers? Is it going to add value to prospects? Those can be parameters, like how is it a net new thing that's a differentiator for the company versus is it, just a table stakes feature that, like we're just trying to close a feature gap relative to a competitor. So there's a lot of different frameworks for how you can do tiering. But I think the big thing to just think about is like everything should have some kind of launch. You may just be adjusting like what level of effort goes into that launch. So if it's really small, you might just throw it in a newsletter. But if it's really large, you may do a press release around it. Like you may actually do a bunch of PR around it.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Like
yeah, and so I think like going back to how these things end up being successful. One of the biggest things that I talk to hundreds of companies all the time about launching stuff, and I think the single biggest failure point in a lot of the companies that we talk to is like they haven't systematized their launches effectively. And like when you have a real kind of go-to-market process, it just makes all of the execution easier, but it also results in more successful launches because those launches, there's a lot more clarity across the other teams about how to engage with that launch and like what their roles are in this process. So when you're thinking about like systematizing launches, there's a couple of things you got to keep in mind. One is like you have to do research. Way too many companies just skip the research step when they're launching stuff, and they're just like, like product told us why they're building this thing, and so we're just going to go out and ship it, based on whatever product said. And I have some horror stories about this. Like we went through a big launch at Rippling for our PEO, and it was like the messaging was way off because we thought we had a bunch of assumptions that we never validated as we were going through the launch process, and we ended up having, like, now it's working, but it took a lot of like pain and thrash to adjust post-launch.
I think that is, I think, not necessarily intuitive, particularly for like a founder that's close to building the product. So, we're doing this launch in mid-August. Yeah, I've obviously been around our product for a long time, and I talk to customers a lot. But I still have my own language and own model of what we do and why it's important. And so it was interesting. We had a new VP of marketing start literally on Monday, and comes in with a very fresh perspective. And the first thing he did is start, like, you set up maybe 4 or 5 customer interviews and started digging into gong calls, and came back with this kind of report. And it was amazing, actually. Like, just I'd say the simplicity of the language is a lot just more normal English language when your customers use it, versus like the fancy product language that you use, which is probably the right thing to do, is use the customer's language. But I was off, and we wouldn't have known that unless we actually talked to customers and listened to customers' voice, right?
Yeah, 100%. It's like customers are going to speak about these things with a different language than the company does internally, and the company has a set of assumptions that are driving everything that may also be like fueled with some blind spots. Like a lot of companies, like we run into this when we're shipping things occasionally. Like, there's a lot of surface area that our product covers, and we oftentimes like don't even, like, because we haven't looked at a competitor recently, like we won't realize that like some of our competitors have a couple of the features that we have, like in our heads built up as one of the like really important things that we're building. And that lack of competitive analysis ends up manifesting in like most companies, because it's hard to keep a pulse on what competitors are doing at all times. And so, every time you are introducing a new thing, you need to go back and like revalidate all of those assumptions that you already have.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so the other like important stuff to keep in mind here is like centralization. Launches include a lot of moving parts. You have things going on the product side of the house. You have context like research getting collected. You have the actual planning and documentation getting created. And then you have all the executional work happening across like design, creating assets, the different tasks for setting up your CRM, for example. And when that stuff is fragmented, it's very easy for it to fall across like a whole bunch of different docs and tools. And there's no central view for folks across the company around what is actually going on. So it's really critical to like make sure that at whatever systems you're building here, you are creating some kind of hub where people can get a central view of like everything that's going on with that launch. The other thing to, keep in mind is like, people forget the internal marketing component of launches, which is arguably the most important.
Yeah, totally.
Like you have a sales and success team who needs to be able to talk about the thing that you're building. And if you don't effectively keep them abreast of that thing coming up, get them the information that they need in order to be able to talk about it, and then get them the assets that they need in order to be able to hand it off to customers, the thing's not going to sell itself. And so getting the campaigns live on the marketing side of the house that are going to push outwards through ads or PR is only half the battle. You really need to like make a concerted effort throughout every stage of the process to be pushing the briefing information outwards across all the different teams internally.
Yeah, getting sales excited too. I mean, you think about, if you have 40 BDRs, right? Like the comparative reach of that team relative to marketing is pretty substantial, right? So that is a a mouthpiece for the company, and getting them excited to do that and getting them on the right message is definitely critical.
Yeah, 100%. It's like people internally have competing priorities, and they've got other things that they're thinking of, like whether it's sales or whether it's like your comms team, that you want to get PR around the thing that you're launching, like they've got other stuff that they're working on. And so you need to reinforce to them the importance of the thing that you're launching, and like do some marketing to them first and foremost, because then they're going to be the ones who are going to market it externally.
Yeah. Interesting.
I think the other two big notes that I'll call out here is, make sure that like it's not fire and forget. A lot of companies, they'll launch things, they'll pat themselves on the back and then move on to the next thing without ever actually measuring like whether that thing drove the impact that they wanted, and they don't debrief on what worked, what didn't work about the process. And that results in a process that ends up not being repeatable. They haven't created some structure around it, so that then the next time a launch rolls around, they can apply those learnings from the past one. So it's important to like think about, like, as you're building out these systems, how are you collecting learnings from that launch and then feeding that back into the next one, and making sure that you're using a consistent process so that everybody across the org actually understands like how to engage with it, on the next one.
Yeah, totally makes sense.
So like, if you think about like what the process looks like, basically, like when you're launching stuff, there's a couple of different stages. The first stage is you're doing all of your upfront planning. This is where you're kind of like just laying out your objectives, your positioning and messaging, kind of the overall timelines for how you're rolling the thing out, what channels you're going to use. You're probably planning out like what tasks you need to get done or assets you need to create. But as you move through the launch process, there's actually a couple of stages before the hard public launch. So typically, like, if you have a larger launch, and you may skip the alpha stage for smaller launches, but you probably want to do kind of a quiet internal release, dog food internally as a company, and use the product, knock out all the kind of primary bugs on the product side of the house, and then start doing one-to-one user research at this stage. This is kind of also the period where you're going to start like briefing internal teams and telling them that this thing is coming and how they're going to want to think about talking about it, because you need to get way far out in advance of that public launch if you want to be able to line up certain activity, like for example PR. You need to start briefing those folks far in advance of the actual launch. Once you start moving into beta is when you want to do, like, this is typically like if you're doing a soft launch and you want to do a quiet launch to a small group of customers. Not enough companies do betas, and they don't do, kind of soft launches where they can start actually collecting real live customer feedback. And like, this is where I think, tools like UserEvidence are hugely valuable, because if you're able to actually get a product in the hands of a couple of your like biggest fans early on, you can then come out when you actually do your public launch and have actual real life customer story that you can highlight as a use case for evidence for how you actually use that product and like what values derived from it. And you're not just talking about like, hey, we built a new thing, like, hope you like it. You're actually looking at the real business value.
Yeah, and if you think about, who are those beta customers and the kind of crossing the chasm model, like you have a group that's inherently kind of like, they love to try new things. They're pretty like inventive, and they like to experiment. And then they also like to advocate publicly, and their kind of social capital is often derived from being the first to find someone and then go share it with someone else. So if you can nail making those people happy, but in a structured way, harness their kind of desire to want to be public advocates, that's a huge kind of social proof boost that goes beyond just, here's what the feature does.
Yeah, it's also an opportunity for you to actually just reinforce those customers' excitement with your company too. Like, they feel special that they get early access to something that not the rest of the world hasn't even heard about yet. So it's a real opportunity to like both market to those customers and then use them to amplify the marketing message more broadly once you start talking to the kind of like the later adopters.
Right. Yeah, totally.
The stuff to keep in mind around planning here is also like, this is a good time to start pre-marketing. Not enough companies do actual pre-marketing around their launches, and they don't like tease that something is coming. This is a good time to start introducing to that broader set of people that you're going to want to introduce the product to, that like something is coming, set a date for it so that people know when to look for it. And this is also when you're going to want to start like training those sales and success teams so that they actually really like on launch day are able to field all of the inbound questions that they're going to get. And then the public launch is like what people think about when they think about launches often, which is, like, this is when the press release is going live. This is when all the websites getting updated. We're doing that big public announcement campaign. And so, if you think about this process, it's like the things leading up to the launch day are actually dramatically more important than the actual launch day itself.
Yeah, I mean, you think like consumer companies do this incredibly well, right? Where there's some anticipation and some, spice behind what's coming up next. So yeah, I like that concept.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, like, you think about like when we were launching things at PlayStation has 12 cycles, and it's like the majority of the launch effort and campaign effort all goes before the actual launch day itself.
Yeah, for sure. Makes sense.
So yeah, and then just to quickly run you through kind of how we help with some of this stuff in Ignition, a big part of what we do is we help structure repeatability around this process and create kind of the handoff between product through to product marketing, and then all the communication outwards across the rest of the team. So we do a lot of other stuff. We have some automated competitive intelligence tools and customer research tools baked into the product as well. But sticking to kind of like, how do you actually bring things to market? Within Ignition, like the first thing that you're going to want to do is like you go to, and just to kind of talk through this more abstractly outside of the world of Ignition too, is, like you're going to want to first have a clear handle on what's going on with your product roadmap. So whether you're using a tool like us or your product team is maintaining an external roadmap that you're working with them on, you should be like regularly in sync with them on what's coming down the pipe well in advance of it actually shipping, so that you can start doing planning, ahead of time. But what we do is, we basically, have a concept of roadmap, so you can integrate this into the place that your product team is working as well. So if they're living in product board or they're living in Jira, we can pull that in. We'll pull through context like research, personas, insights that are driving that roadmap effort. And when you create a go-to-market plan in Ignition, basically we let you kind of package up things into that launch. And so if you think about when you're creating a go-to-market plan, the other thing to keep in mind is like each individual feature doesn't need its own launch. Oftentimes you want to bundle these up into a larger narrative that tells a customer story that's like much more digestible to that customer. So, when you're thinking about launching things, don't think about it as like each individual thing that got built. Think about it through the lens of like, what is the larger story that a customer cares about, and see if there's an opportunity to package up a couple of different features into a bigger narrative. So we'll package that stuff up. We'll pull through the connections and the objects that exist, that are the context that's informing those roadmap items. And then we'll create our launch plan. And so we'll basically give it a name, give it a description, pull through, some context up front around the launch itself. So when are we aiming to launch it? What type of launch are we shipping? So, again, another important thing to keep in mind is like launches aren't all necessarily products and features. You may want to be doing, campaigns that are introducing new messages, or may be introducing a new market. Like there's a lot of different types of things that should be following this same kind of go-to-market motion. Evan, you were kind of asking about like, how do you kind of prioritize what things like big, medium, small launches? We even have some frameworks baked into the product for actually doing that. So, we'll help kind of land on consistent tiering for that launch based on a couple of different factors. And then we'll create our launch plan itself. And as we create these launch plans, basically we're going to take all the context that you need to think through in a launch plan. House it here for you. So, you can house all of your objectives and KPIs, your timelines, your briefing documentation, your asset management, your project management. And we have a workflow that helps kind of create these more repeatably. So we'll take into account that type and tier of launch. If you have a promotional budget, you can add a promotional budget. And then we'll help walk through kind of setting objectives. So mapping out like what you want to target to what metrics you want to move post-launch, pull through personas from your persona library. So you can basically maintain kind of a core source of truth for what customers care about, with repurposable personas that you can basically use across all your different go-to-market plans and roadmap items. And then we're going to use all that context, type, tier, budget, et cetera. We're going to make some recommendations around what channels should be used to promote this launch, as well as kind of like what the overall timeline looks like for those core kind of alpha, beta, launch, GA phases. And these channels are actually going to then dictate what assets we need to create, what tasks we need to get done. So like, obviously, depending on where you're promoting things, it's going to shift the things that you actually need to create for that launch. So based on channel plans, we'll create an asset plan. We'll auto tag all this stuff with your launch plans, or with the launch, the product line, the channels that those assets are being used for. So that then it rolls up to a master asset library where you can maintain kind of a searchable, filterable repository post-launch.
That concept, like, and now I know why we saw the product marketers, right? Because all this underlying messaging, positioning, and planning work, where we step in then is like, all right, now we need assets, and a lot of that assets is like you were talking about, customer stories. But it's interesting just to see, when you kind of look at the permutations, you have 4 personas there. You could overlay that across 6 geos and 18 different industries or something like that. That creates this huge problem where it's like, all right, now we need assets and targeted content to go speak to all these distinct audiences. But yeah, it's just interesting to see. I mean, there's software here, obviously, but there's a ton of expertise built in that, a normal person wouldn't necessarily have, which is pretty cool to see.
Yeah, it's so easy to forget some of this stuff, right? Like there's a lot of moving parts, and like and it's so common. I've run into this 1,000 times in the past where you get towards the end of a launch when it's just about to go live and you realize, oh shoot, we forgot to create Facebook ads for the Facebook ads that need to go live on this day, or like we never created like product screenshots that, and the press story needs product screenshots, or we didn't create a case study. So you end up like right at the 11th hour and you just don't have the things created that you needed to, and you end up having to push the launch date. And it's extremely disruptive when you push launch dates, and like cascading that through all the different teams is super hard. So you don't want to end up in that scenario.
So Derek, we have about 3 minutes here. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on like, so we were talking about obviously customer stories makes the communication of the value of this feature set or group of feature sets, a lot more interesting. The challenge is though, like, a lot of these customers are new. And so there's this kind of chicken and the egg problem where it's like, we have all these new features, but not a whole lot of people have used them yet. And then if you're selling to bigger companies, there's this added challenge where, all right, if we do want to go get like a case study or a quote for a press release, we're doing this right now, and it's a Fortune 500 company, like, well, that's going to take 3 or 4 months to get approved. So it's like, how do we reduce the friction there to get something from customers, when traditionally it takes a long time to go get customer stories?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, I think probably this is more your wheelhouse than mine. Is when you start infusing research in this process, like end of the day, you should be researching at every step of this process. So like as you're going through that early part, collecting or setting up your positioning and messaging, you need to be like talking to customers live. But then as you start like getting through the process, you need to turn that into real assets that you can use that's customer facing. So, I mean, I would love to hear your kind of experience working through this, with user evidence.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, the method of conversation changes based on the group size, right? If it's a handful of people, then obviously a live conversation makes sense. That said, if you're, Airtable or ClickUp or Notion, like your beta test is actually probably on like a slice of 5,000 users, which is, 1% of your user base or something like that. But in that case, you need a more structured, scaled way of collecting feedback in an organized way to kind of then divine or kind of bucket the unique insights from those customers. And then hopefully, if we can, produce content and evidence and proof points to go support this launch. So if the new feature is generative AI, right, which everyone is doing right now, okay, cool. Obviously it's sexy and whatever, but like what type of business value is that generative AI feature driving? Like one of our clients is Jasper.ai. It actually helps people get content out faster, saves them 8 hours per week. I think, what I've seen from successful launches that are more interesting is when there's a customer story that takes all these features and what they do, but translates them into a more understandable bottom line, like what's the business impact, like how does this actually help me move the needle on something. So I think if you can find a way to find nuggets of proof within, especially when you do have the beta audience or even post launch when it's a larger user base, that then becomes the fuel for the subsequent GTM motion, which is a lot of very sales driven, and gives salespeople the confidence to go out there and tell stories about how they're actually driving success for their customers.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like, if you think about like where you're infusing that stuff, it's, like I said, I think every single step of the process, you need to be having those customer conversations. And, I think like as soon as you have the product in customers' hands, in whether that's a beta or whether that's like a very small subset of people in your alpha stage, is the perfect time to start going and collecting like real proof points back from them. And like you should be teeing up as you're shipping that beta to people like, hey, look, like we're going to come ask you for some proof points.
Yeah, it's an expectation, right? And they're usually, given the nature of their early adopterness, they're probably fine with that. I think if you strip out like the biggest insight I think we would take away from our customers, typically people ask like, hey, can you give us a testimony or a case study? Especially a case study implies this kind of big, long, gnarly process with approvals and stuff like that. And if you're at a big company, you're not going to do that, right? So if you can reduce that friction around the ask, make it more feedback oriented, sharing best practices, share with the group type of thing versus like have your brand people like endorse us as a vendor. I think you just get a lot more candid, interesting feedback that creates better content anyway than the kind of vanilla branded kind of sanitized story anyway.
Well, yeah, and one of the things that I love about like what you guys do is that you're really focused on like how do you quantify outcomes for customers too. I think like too often when we build case studies as product marketers, we build case studies around like, oh, it like made my life better. And, it's like, oh, it, saved me a bunch of time, but that's not really tied to a real outcome. And so, like when you're building case studies, it's really important to even up front, like tee up for that customer, like, hey, like when we come to the back part of this and I start asking you for testimonials, I start asking you for feedback, I start asking you for case studies, like I'd love if you could think about like this 1 or 2 metrics that like we're trying to measure, like, are we actually helping you move?
Yeah, having a good sense of like what the future ROI narrative for that product is going to be, right? And so you can kind of back into how do we ask questions then to get evidence around those key value props is totally smart. But well, cool. This is super interesting. I want to be respectful of folks' time and yours, of course. I've learned a lot that I'll take into my launch in mid-August, which will be cool. But yeah, there's clearly there's some method to the madness in doing this, so it's fun to learn about.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you everyone for attending. We will make sure to send out the recording and have a great rest of the week here. Thank you, Derek, for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys.
All right, have a good one. Bye-bye.